The torches along the palace walls burned with an unnatural blue flame as servants rushed through the corridors carrying silver trays and crystal goblets, filled with dark liquid that Park Junho tried not to think about too deeply. He had worked in the vampire palace of Noctira for 15 years now. Ever since the night his village was destroyed and Queen Morvain had taken him in as a child servant rather than a meal. Some called it mercy, while others called it a different kind of cruelty. But Junho had learned to survive in a world where he was surrounded by predators who could snap his neck with a flick of their wrists. Tonight was the most important night in a century, and every vampire noble from across the realm had gathered in the grand throne room for the choosing ceremony. Princess Seraphina, the only daughter of Queen Morvain, had reached her 1,000th year of existence, and tradition demanded that she select a consort from among the noble vampire houses. Junho balanced a tray of blood wine as he weaved through the crowd of pale faces and hungry eyes. The vampire nobles barely noticed him, which was exactly how he preferred it, because invisibility meant safety in this world of fangs and eternal darkness. Lord Cassius stood at the front of the gathered nobles, his silver hair cascading down his shoulders and his crimson eyes gleaming. With absolute confidence, everyone knew he would be chosen tonight because his family controlled the largest territory in the realm, and an alliance through marriage would strengthen Queen Morvain's already iron grip on the vampire kingdom. Junho had seen Lord Cassius many times over the years and had learned to avoid him at all costs because the vampire lord enjoyed tormenting human servants for sport. He remembered watching Cassius drain a serving girl simply because she had spilled wine on his boots, and the memory still haunted his dreams. The trumpet sounded with a haunting melody that echoed through the stone halls as Queen Morvain descended from her obsidian throne. She had ruled for 3,000 years, and her beauty was as terrible as it was perfect. With skin like polished marble and eyes that held the weight of countless lifetimes, behind her walked Princess Seraphina, and Junho found himself pausing mid-step as he caught sight of her. She wore a gown of midnight black that seemed to absorb the light around her, and her dark hair was adorned with rubies that looked like drops of frozen blood. But it was her expression that caught his attention, because unlike the other vampires who radiated hunger and ambition, Seraphine's face held something that looked almost like exhaustion. She looked like a prisoner walking to her execution rather than a princess about to choose her future husband. Ceremony began with each noble house presenting their candidate, and Junho continued his duties as the vampire lords knelt before the princess one by one, slipped through a side corridor to fetch more wine from the kitchens when he heard a soft sound that made him stop. It was crying, quiet and controlled, but unmistakably the sound of someone in pain. Junho followed the sound around a corner and found Princess Seraphina standing alone in the shadows with her back against the cold stone wall and her shoulders trembling. For a moment, he considered running, because a human discovering a vampire princess in a moment of weakness could easily result in death, but something held him in place. Perhaps the memory of his own loneliness, or perhaps simple human compassion that he had never been able to suppress despite 15 years among monsters. He cleared his throat softly so as not to startle her, and she spun around with her fangs bared and her eyes flashing. Junho did not flinch or cower or beg for his life the way most humans would have done, simply bowed his head respectfully and said that he was sorry for intruding and that he hoped Her Highness was well. Seraphina stared at him with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if she could not understand why he was not screaming or running. She asked him why he was not afraid, and Junho considered the question carefully before answering. He told her that he had been afraid every day for 15 years, and that at some point, fear simply became background noise that he learned to ignore. A strange sound escaped from the princess, and it took Junho a moment to realize she was laughing. Though it was a hollow and bitter sound, she asked him his name, and he told her, and she repeated it slowly as if tasting the syllables on her tongue. Then she asked him something that no vampire had ever asked him in all his years of service. She asked him if he was happy here in the Palashane, who thought about lying because lies were safer than truth in this world. But something about her eyes made him want to be honest. He told her that happiness was a luxury he could not afford, but that he had found moments of peace in small things like the sunrise he watched from the kitchen windows each morning, or the stories he read in the old books that no one else wanted. Serafina looked at him as if he had spoken in a language she had forgotten long ago. She told him that she had not watched a sunrise in 800 years because the light burned her skin, and she had not read a book for pleasure in even longer because every moment of her existence was consumed by duty and politics. Junho told her that he was sorry to hear that, and that it sounded like a lonely way to live. The princess flinched as if he had struck her, and for a terrible moment he thought he had gone too far, but then her expression softened into something that might have been gratitude, and she told him that no one had ever said something so honest to her in centuries. The sound of footsteps approaching made them both tense, and Seraphine's mask of cold composure slid back into place. She told him to return to his duties, and that they had never spoken. And Junho bowed and slipped away into the shadows. He returned to the throne room just as Queen Morvain called for her daughter to make her choice. Lord Cassius stepped forward with a predatory smile. Absolutely certain that victory was his, Serafina descended the steps slowly, her eyes scanning the crowd of kneeling nobles. She walked past Lord Cassius without a glance. She walked past every vampire lord who had presented himself, and then she stopped. Her eyes found Junho standing among the servants in the shadows at the back of the room. She raised her hand and pointed directly at him. The entire palace froze. The silence that filled the throne room was so complete that Junho could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears like a war drum. Every vampire in the chamber had turned to stare at him with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to murderous rage. He wanted to believe he had misunderstood, that Princess Serafina had been pointing at someone else, but her dark eyes were locked onto his face with an intensity that left no room for doubt. Queen Morvain rose from her throne with a movement so swift that she seemed to blur, and her voice cracked through the air like a whip as she demanded to know what her daughter was doing. Serafina did not waver, and her voice rang out clear and strong as she declared that she had made her choice. According to the ancient laws, she had chosen Park Junho, human servant of the palace, to be her consort. Lord Cassius let out a roar of fury that shook the chandeliers overhead, and his fangs extended fully as he screamed that this was an insult to every noble house in the realm. He demanded that the choice be declared invalid because a human could not possibly be chosen over pure-blooded vampire nobility. But Queen Morvain held up her hand, and the room fell silent once more. Her face was a mask of cold fury as she spoke in a voice that dripped with barely contained rage. She declared that the ancient laws were clear and that the choosing could not be undone once made. Princes had spoken, and her word was binding. Guards appeared at Junho's sides, and for a moment he thought they were going to kill him right there in front of everyone. But instead they escorted him forward through the crowd of vampires who parted before him like he was carrying a plague. He could feel their hatred burning into his back with every step he took toward the raised platform where the royal family stood. Serafina descended to meet him and took his hand in hers. Her skin was cold as marble, but her grip was gentle. As she drew him up the steps to stand beside her, she leaned close and whispered in his ear so quietly that only he could hear. She told him that he was the only one who had looked at her like she was a person and not a prize to be. Juan Junho did not know what to say, so he simply squeezed her hand in response. Queen Morvain dismissed the assembly with a wave of her hand, and the vampire nobles filed out of the throne room with murder in their eyes. Lord Cassius was the last to leave, and he paused at the doorway to look back at Junho with a smile that promised suffering. Then he was gone and Junho was alone with the two most powerful vampires in existence. Queen turned on her daughter immediately and demanded an explanation for this. Madness, she asked if Seraphina had lost her mind or if this was some kind of rebellion. Against her authority, Seraphina stood her ground and told her mother that she had spent 900 years watching vampire suitors scheme and lie and plot. She had seen them all as clearly as looking through glass because they wanted power and nothing more, but this human had shown her something she had not experienced in centuries, had shown her honesty and kindness without expecting anything in return. Queen Morvain laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. She told her daughter that honesty and kindness would not protect the realm from their enemies. She said that Seraphina had thrown away a powerful alliance for a creature who would be dead from old age in a mere handful of decades. Seraphina replied that perhaps that was exactly the point. She said that vampires had forgotten what it meant to live because they had eternity stretching before them and nothing felt urgent or precious anymore. But humans knew that every moment mattered because their time was limited. That was what she wanted to learn from Junho. How to feel alive again after centuries of numbness. The queen stared at her daughter for a long moment, and something flickered in her ancient eyes that might have been understanding or might have been contempt. Finally, she spoke and her words made Junho's blood run cold. She declared that if her daughter insisted on this foolish choice, then the human would have to prove himself worthy. Ancient trials would be invoked. The same trials that had tested vampire consorts for millennia. Seraphina protested that those trials were designed for vampires and that no human could possibly survive them. But the queen silenced her with a look and said that if the human was truly worthy, then the trials would prove it, and if he was not, then at least the problem would solve itself. Escorted Junho to a chamber in the noble wing of the palace, a room larger than any space he had ever occupied in his entire life. The bed was draped in silk, and the walls were hung with tapestries that depicted ancient vampire battles. But the room felt like a gilded cage, because he knew that just outside the door there were countless vampires who wanted him dead. He sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process everything that had happened in the past hour. This morning he had been a kitchen servant, worried about whether he had enough bread for the day. Now he was the consort candidate of a vampire princess and the target of an entire kingdom's hatred. A soft knock at the door made him tense, but it was only a young vampire servant who brought him food and wine. The servant looked at him with something like pity and warned him to be careful, because Lord Cassius had already begun gathering allies against him. Junho thanked the servant and asked for his name. Servant seemed surprised by the question, as if no one had ever bothered to ask before. He said his name was Min and that he had been watching Junho in the kitchens for years. He said that Junho was different from other humans because he treated the lower vampire servants with respect, when most humans were too terrified to even look at them. After Min left, Junho ate his meal and tried to think about his situation clearly. He had no power and no allies and no supernatural abilities. All he had was his mind and his ability to observe and adapt. Those qualities had kept him alive for 15 years in a palace full of predators. Perhaps they could keep him alive through whatever trials awaited him. A few hours later, another knock came at his door, but this time it was not a servant. Lord Cassius stood in the doorway with 2 guards behind him and a smile that showed every one of his gleaming fangs. He stepped into the room without waiting for an invitation and circled Junho like a wolf examining prey. Then he made his offer in a voice as smooth as poison. He told Junho that he could still escape this fate if he withdrew from the choosing willingly. He promised gold and safe passage to any human kingdom Junho desired. All he had to do was admit that he was not worthy of the princess. Junho looked into those crimson eyes and saw the truth behind the pleasant offer. Lord Cassius would never let him leave alive because the insult had been too Great, this was a trap designed to make Junho's death look like an accident or a desertion, so Junho did something that surprised even himself. He refused. He told Lord Cassius that he would take his chances with the trials. The vampire lord's smile vanished and was replaced by something cold and terrible. He leaned close and whispered that Junho had just made the worst mistake of his short life. Then he turned and swept out of the room, leaving Junho alone with the certain knowledge that he had just made a very powerful enemy. The first trial began 3 nights after the choosing ceremony, and the entire court gathered at the edge of the Blackwood forest to watch what they assumed would be Junho's death. The rules were simple according to Queen Morvain, who announced them. With cold satisfaction in her voice, Junho would enter the forest at midnight, and 5 vampire hunters would pursue him. If he survived until dawn, he would pass the trial. If they caught him, then his blood would seal his failure. Princess Seraphina stood beside her mother with her hands clenched into fists and her face carefully blank, but Junho could see the fear in her eyes, and he wished he could tell her that everything would be fine. Even though he was not sure himself, the horn sounded and Junho ran into the darkness of the Blackwood with nothing but a small knife and his wits. The forest was ancient and twisted with trees so thick that almost no moonlight reached the ground. He had studied the palace maps for years because a servant who knew the grounds could avoid dangerous nobles more easily. Now that knowledge might save his life, because he knew that the Blackwood connected to the old supply tunnels that ran beneath the palace walls. The vampire hunters entered the forest 5 minutes after him, and Junho could hear their laughter echoing through the trees. They were not worried because to them this was sport, and he was nothing more than prey. But Junho had learned something important during his years in the palace. Vampires were powerful, but they were also arrogant, and they underestimated humans. Constantly moved through the forest as quietly as possible, using every trick he had learned from watching the servants who poached game in the royal woods. He found the entrance to the old tunnels, hidden beneath a fallen tree, and slipped inside just as the first hunter caught his scent. The tunnels were cramped and dark, but Junho knew them well because he had used them many times to move supplies without being seen by the nobles. He crawled through passages too narrow for the larger vampires to follow, and doubled back multiple times to confuse. His trail hours passed, and the hunters grew frustrated as their prey continued to elude them. They split up to cover more ground, and that was when Junho made his move. He emerged from the tunnels near the eastern edge of the forest where the trees thinned and the first gray light of dawn was beginning to appear. The hunters converged on him from 3 directions, but they were too late. Sun broke over the horizon, and they were forced to retreat into the shadows, hissing with rage as their quarry stood in the golden light that they could not enter. Junho had survived the first trial. The second trial came 1 week later, and this time there would be no running. He had to face a vampire champion in single combat. Rules stated that the fight would continue until one opponent yielded or was unable to continue. Killing was permitted but not required. Lord Cassius had personally selected the champion, a massive vampire warrior named Victor, who had killed over 100 opponents in the dueling arena. Victor stood nearly 7 feet tall and carried a sword that looked like it weighed more than Junho's entire bow. Gio was given a standard sword and shield, and he knew immediately that he could not win through strength. Victor was faster and stronger and more skilled than any human could ever hope to be. But as Junho studied his opponent, he noticed something interesting. Victor was showboating for the crowd, performing elaborate flourishes and poses instead of simply attacking. He wanted to make a spectacle of defeating the human who had dared to reach above his station. Junho realized that the rules of the duel might be his only advantage. He had memorized the ancient combat laws during his week of preparation, and he knew there were technicalities that most vampires had forgotten over the centuries. When the fight began, Junho did not attack, he simply defended. using his shield to block Victor's strikes and giving ground steadily. The crowd began to jeer and call him a coward, but Junho ignored them. Victor grew more aggressive and more careless as his frustration mounted. He wanted a glorious victory, and Junho was denying him that satisfaction after an hour of this defensive dance. Victor made a mistake. He swung his massive sword in a wide arc that was meant to be a finishing blow, but Junho ducked under it and stepped inside his guard. Instead of attacking, Junho dropped his weapons and placed both hands on Victor's chest. Then he spoke the ancient words of formal surrender. But not his own surrender. He declared that by the laws of the old combat codes, a warrior who accepted an opponent's touch over their heart without responding was considered to have yielded the duel. Victor froze in confusion because no one had invoked that rule in over 1,000 years. But the rule was clear in the ancient texts, and the judges had no choice but to declare Junho the winner. The crowd erupted in chaos, and Lord Cassius screamed that this was cheating. But Queen Morvaine silenced him with a single look and declared that the old laws were the old laws. Junho had passed the second trial. That night, Princess Seraphina came to his chambers for the first time. She slipped through the door like a shadow and stood before him with an expression he could not read. She told him that no one had ever survived both trials using nothing but intelligence and courage. She said that he was the most remarkable human she had ever encountered. Junho told her that he was just a servant trying not to die. Seraphina laughed, and it was a real laugh this time. Warm and surprised, she sat beside him, and they talked for hours about everything and nothing. She told him about the loneliness of immortality, how watching centuries pass had drained the color from the world. He told her about the small joys he found in simple things. The taste of fresh bread and the sound of rain on the roof and the way the sunrise painted the sky in colors that changed every single day. She listened with wonder as if he was describing miracles. When she finally left as dawn approached, she paused at the door and told him that she had made the right choice. Then she was gone, and Junho was left alone with the knowledge that he was beginning to care for her as more than just a means of survival. The next morning, he was summoned before Queen Morvaine to learn the nature of his final trial. The Queen's smile was sharp as a blade as she delivered the news. The third trial would be a test of worthiness, conducted by the Queen herself. No human had ever faced her judgment and lived to tell them. Junho understood immediately that this trial was not about proving himself. It was about giving the Queen an excuse to kill him without breaking the ancient laws. Had 2 nights to prepare for what might be the last moments of his life. The doors to Queen Morvaine's private throne room were carved from black wood that was older than most human civilizations, and Junho stood before them knowing that he might never walk back out. No guards escorted him inside because this trial was between him and the Queen alone. Whatever happened in that room would be witnessed only by the 2 of them. He pushed open the heavy doors and stepped into darkness so complete that, for a moment, he thought he had gone blind. Then torches flickered to life along the walls, and he saw Queen Morvaine seated on a throne of bones at the far end of the chamber. She looked different here, away from the public eye. More ancient and more terrible, with shadows pooling around her like living things. She told him to approach, and her voice echoed from every direction, as if the walls themselves were speaking. Junho walked forward until he stood at the base of her throne and waited for whatever test she had prepared. The Queen studied him with those ageless eyes, and then she began to speak. She told him about the first human she had ever killed, a farmer who had wandered too close to her lair 3,000 years ago. She told him about the wars she had fought and the kingdoms she had destroyed, and the rivers of blood she had spilled over her endless lifetime. She told him about the lovers she had taken and discarded, the children she had outlived, the friends who had betrayed her, and then she asked him a simple question. She asked him why he thought he was worthy of her daughter when he would be dead and forgotten before Seraphina had even noticed the passage of time. Junho considered his answer carefully. because he knew that the wrong words would mean his death, but he also knew that lies would not work against a creature who had been reading human hearts for millennia. So he told her the truth. He said that he did not think he was worthy, not by the standards she was using. He was not powerful or immortal or noble. He was just a human servant who had spent his life surrounded by beings who could crush him without effort. But he told her that worthiness was not always about power. Sometimes it was about seeing someone clearly and caring for them without wanting anything in return. He told her that her daughter had spent centuries surrounded by vampires who wanted her throne and her influence and her blood, but no one had bothered to ask her if she was happy, or if she was lonely, or if she ever wished she could watch a sunrise. He had asked those questions not because he wanted something from her, but because he genuinely wanted to know. Queen's expression flickered with something that might have been surprise. She leaned forward and asked him what he saw when he looked at her daughter Junho. Told her that he saw a woman who had forgotten how to feel because feeling was too painful. When you had forever stretching ahead of you, he said that Seraphina had built walls around her heart to protect herself from the emptiness of immortality, but those walls had become a prison, and she had been trapped inside for so long that she had forgotten what freedom felt like. Queen Morvain was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its coldness. She asked him what made him think a mere human could break down walls that had stood for centuries. Answered that humans were very good at breaking things, including things that seemed unbreakable. He said that mortality gave humans a different perspective because they knew that every moment was precious and every connection mattered. Vampires had lost that urgency because they had all the time in the world, but sometimes having too much time meant you stopped appreciating what you had. The queen rose from her throne and descended the steps until she stood directly before him. She was so close that he could feel the cold radiating from her skin. Like winter wind, she told him that she could kill him right now, and no one would ever know what really happened. She could drain every drop of blood from his body and tell her daughter that he had failed the trial. Junho looked into her eyes and saw the truth there. She wanted him to beg or to break or to prove that he was just like every other weak human she had encountered over her long life. But he would not give her that satisfaction. He told her that she could kill him if she chose, but it would not change what her daughter felt. Seraphina had found something real in him, and destroying him would only prove that the queen was afraid of what that meant. He asked her when she had felt something real herself. The question hung in the air between them like a blade. Queen Morvain's eyes widened, and for the first time since Junho had known her, she looked uncertain. She stepped back and turned away from him, as if she could not bear to meet his gaze. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. She told him that she had felt something real once, long ago, when she was still young enough to remember what it meant to be vulnerable. She had loved someone with all of her heart, and when that person died, she had sworn never to feel that way again. For 3,000 years she had kept that promise, and she had become powerful and feared and completely alone. Junho understood then that the queen was not just testing him. She was confronting something in herself that she had buried for millennia. He told her that he was sorry for her loss, and that he understood why she had chosen to close herself off. But he also told her that watching her daughter make a different choice must be difficult. Seraphina was choosing to feel again. Despite the risk of pain, she was choosing connection over safety and love over power. The queen turned back to face him, and there were tears in her eyes. The first tears she had shed in over 1,000 years. She told him that he was either the bravest human she had ever met or the most foolish. Then she did something that Junho never expected. She declared him worthy. The doors burst open, and Lord Cassius stormed in with guards at his back and fury on his face. He demanded to know why the trial was over so quickly and why the human was still alive. Queen Morvain turned on him with eyes that burned like crimson fire and told him that she had made her judgment The human had passed, and the choosing would precede Cassius. Began to argue, but the queen silenced him with a wave of her hand that sent him flying across the room. She told him that if he questioned her authority again, she would remove his head from his shoulders. As Junho was escorted from the chamber, he caught a glimpse of Lord Cassius picking himself up from the floor. The vampire lord's expression promised that this was not over, the war was just beginning. The night before the bonding ceremony, Junho lay awake in his chambers, knowing that sleep would not come. He had survived the impossible trials, but he was not foolish enough to believe that Lord Cassius would simply accept defeat. The vampire lord had too much pride and too much to lose. Something was coming, and Junho intended to be ready. He had spent the past 3 days preparing his chambers with every trap and defense he could devise, tripwires connected to bells, furniture arranged to create obstacles, silver dust scattered near the windows, because he had learned that it burned vampire skin. It was not much, but it was something. The attack came 2 hours before midnight. His door exploded inward, and 3 masked vampires rushed into the room with weapons drawn. But Junho was not in his bed, where they expected him to be. He was crouched behind an overturned table, and he kicked it forward into the first attacker, sending the vampire stumbling into the silver dust trap. The creature screamed as the silver burned his exposed skin, and Junho used that moment of chaos to slip past them into the corridor. More assassins were waiting outside, but so was the alarm system Junho had rigged with the help of men. The young vampire servant who had become his unexpected ally bells rang throughout the wing, and Junho ran toward the one place he knew he might find safety. He burst into Seraphine's chambers just as she was rising to investigate the noise. Her eyes went wide when she saw the blood on his arm where a blade had grazed him. She did not hesitate, pulling him behind her and baring her fangs at the assassins who had followed him. Voice rang out with a command that froze them in their tracks as she demanded to know who had sent them. The assassins exchanged glances and then attacked anyway, because their master had promised them rewards greater than their fear of the princess, but they had underestimated what a vampire princess could do. When she was protecting someone she cared about, Serafina moved like liquid shadow, disarming 2 of them before they could blink, and throwing a third through the stone wall with a strength that shook the entire tower. Within moments, the remaining assassins were either dead or fleeing into the night guards. Loyal to Queen Morvain arrived seconds later. Summoned by the commotion, Serafina ordered them to seal the palace and find whoever was responsible for this attack. Junho already knew who was behind it. Told Serafina that Lord Cassius would not stop until one of them was dead. They had to end this tonight before more assassins came. Serafina agreed, and together they made their way to the great hall where they knew Cassius would be gathering his supporters. Word had spread quickly through the palace, and vampires from both factions were converging on the throne room. Lord Cassius stood at the center of a group of noble houses who had allied with him against the queen. He was giving a speech about the corruption of their ancient traditions by human influence when Junho and Serafina entered. He smiled like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. He declared that the human had proven himself unworthy by fleeing from his assassins like a coward. He demanded that the choosing be invalidated and that Serafina be given to him as was. Proper Junho stepped forward before Serafina could respond. He told Lord Cassius that running from assassins was not cowardice, but common sense. He asked if Cassius wanted to talk about cowardice because sending killers in the night instead of facing an enemy directly seemed like the act of someone who was afraid. The insult landed exactly as Junho intended, and Cassius snarled with fury. He drew his sword and advanced toward Junho, declaring that he would kill the human himself and end this farce once and for all. But before he could strike, the doors to the throne room burst open and Queen Morvain swept in with her royal guard behind her. She demanded to know what was happening. In her palace, Lord Cassius tried to explain, but Junho interrupted him. He told the queen everything about the assassination attempt and about Cassius breaking into the royal wing with armed vampires. He pointed out that attacking a consort candidate on the eve of the bonding ceremony was treason according to the ancient laws. Queen Morvain turned her terrible gaze on Lord Cassius and asked if these accusations were true. Cassius tried to lie, but men stepped forward from the crowd. The young vampire servant declared that he had witnessed Cassius giving orders to the assassins. Other servants came forward as well. Vampires and humans alike who had suffered under Cassius and his allies for centuries. They had been too afraid to speak before, but Junho's courage had inspired them. The evidence was overwhelming, and Lord Cassius knew I've made one final desperate move. Lunging at Queen Morvain with a hidden blade that had been blessed by dark magic, but the queen was 3,000 years old, and she had not survived that long by being careless. She caught his wrist before the blade could touch her and twisted until the bones shattered. Then she pronounced his sentence in a voice that echoed through the hall like thunder. Lord Cassius was executed on the spot, his ashes scattered by the queen's own hand. The noble houses that had supported him fell to their knees and begged for mercy. Some received it while others did not, depending on how deeply they had been involved in the conspiracy. When it was over, Queen Morvain turned to Junho and studied him with an expression he could not read. She told him that he had saved her life and her kingdom. A human had done what centuries of vampire politics had failed to accomplish. She declared that the bonding ceremony would proceed at dawn instead of at night. This was unprecedented because vampires avoided the sun at all costs, but Seraphina had requested it, and after tonight the queen was inclined to grant her daughter's wishes. As the first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, Junho and Seraphina stood together in the palace garden. The ceremony was brief and beautiful, witnessed by those vampires brave enough to stand in the shadows at the edge of the light. When it was complete, Seraphina took Junho's hand and led him to a spot where the sunlight fell directly on the grass. She had taken a special potion that would allow her to endure the light for a short time. Together, they watched the sunrise, something Seraphina had not done in 800 years. Tears streamed down her face as she saw the colors that Junho had described to her, more beautiful than she had remembered. She told him that she finally understood what he had meant about every moment being precious. Queen Morvain watched from the shadows, and for the first time in 3,000 years, she smiled with something like genuine happiness. She told her daughter that she had chosen well. Junho stood in the light of the new day with the woman he loved beside him. He was still human in a world of immortals. He was still mortal in a kingdom of eternal beings. But he had proven that strength was not about power or speed or living forever. Sometimes strength was about staying true to yourself, even when everything around you demanded that you change. Sometimes it was about seeing the person behind the monster and loving them. Anyway, sometimes it was about a kitchen servant who refused to be afraid. The vampire kingdom entered a new era that morning, one where humans and vampires could stand together as equals. And it all began because a princess looked past the fangs and the power and the endless schemes. She looked past all of it and saw a man who treated her like she was just a person. That simple act of kindness changed everything. That was the day Junho learned that being human was not a weakness to overcome. It was the greatest strength he had ever possessed.